Well, good evening. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's a real pleasure to be able to host Ambassador Kathleen Stephens here at Berkeley. This is the last of our spring, not the second to last, sorry, of our spring series on U.S. foreign policy. And a brief ad before I introduce Kathy. My name is Neil Jock, by the way. I'm the co-host of this series and a research scholar here at the Institute for International Studies. The brief ad is for the last in our series, which will be a lecture by my co-host for the series, Daniel Sargent, professor of history. And Daniel will be talking on April 26th in Moses 223. And he will be speaking on Pax Americana. What's the full title, Daniel? Sketches for an Undiplomatic History. So the title leads you to certain conclusions that we will find more about on April 26th. And that will be the last in the spring series for the U.S. foreign policy series. Also, though, let me note that Professor Lawrence Friedman will be speaking here in the annual Sanford Elberg Lecture. This is an annual lecture honoring his legacy and his thoughts. The title for that lecture is Imagining the Future of War. This is based on a new book that Sir Lawrence Friedman just completed. The title of the book is The Future of War, A History, which again, the title suggests some interesting conclusions. That will be at 5 o'clock on April 9 in the toll room of Alumni House. So, bringing us to tonight, Ambassador Stephens will speak today on the Korea challenge in U.S. foreign policy. It seems that barely a day goes by without some new development in U.S.-Korea relations, so the visit here and the discussion could not be more timely. She promised to explain all of the mysteries of our current policy in the next hour. And I know that's why we're gathered here, to figure out what the heck is going on, but we won't hold her to that promise. Kathleen Stephens is currently the William J. Perry Fellow in the Korea program at the Walter Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center, sadly at Stanford University. She has 4 decades of experience in Korean affairs, first as a Peace Corps volunteer in rural Korea in the 1970s. She and I exchanged some thoughts about that beforehand. I preceded her to Korea, but not as ambassador to South Korea. But I spent 6 months in a rural area of Korea as well, a good bit before she got there, living on a small island, working in an orphanage in Korea. So we had a lot to talk about with respect to the changes and the developments in Korea since that time. Her first attempt to retire from the Foreign Service failed when she was recalled after leaving. She was at Stanford, and was recalled to diplomatic service to lead the U.S. mission in India as the chargé d'affaires during the first 7 months of the Indian administration led by Narendra Modi. We didn't have an ambassador at the time, and she was called back from retirement to serve that. Those of you who might have a question about U.S.-India relations, you have to leave it for the Q&A or afterwards, but that was a particularly interesting and important time in U.S.-India relations. Her diplomatic career has included serving as acting Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in 2012. As I noted, she served as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2008 to 2011. She was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2005 to 2007. Also, she was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs from 2003 to 2005, where she was responsible for post-conflict issues in the Balkans, including Kosovo's future status and the transition from NATO to EU-led forces in Bosnia-Herzegovina. She also served in numerous positions in Asia, Europe, and Washington as well, including U.S. Consul General in Belfast, Northern Ireland, from 1995 to 1998, during which time the negotiation of the Good Friday Agreement took place. She was also Director of European Affairs at the White House during the Clinton administration, following the normalization of U.S. PRC relations. Ambassador Stephens holds a bachelor's degree in East Asian Studies from Prescott College and a Master of Public Administration from Harvard University, in addition to honorary degrees from Chungnam National University and the University of Maryland. She studied at the University of Hong Kong and Oxford University and was an outward-bound instructor in Hong Kong. She previously was a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. Her awards include, among others, the Presidential Meritorious Service Award in 2009, the Sejong Cultural Award, and Korea-America Friendship Association Award in 2013. Ambassador Stephens, thank you for joining us. Please welcome her to Berkeley.
Well, good evening, everyone. And Neil, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. You know, the introductions get longer as one gets older, but it means maybe my speech can be shorter, although it doesn't always happen. I am really pleased to be back in Berkeley. It's a place very close to my heart. I feel like I started to learn about the wider world as a young woman in Arizona when I came out to San Francisco. This is way back in the early 70s, but I never made it to International House. This is a beautiful place, although I feel a little far removed from you here. I really do, every time I come to Berkeley, reflect upon the outsized role that, over the decades, that this great institution and all the people here have played in our own country and in the world. So I'm asked a lot these days to talk about Korea. There's a lot to talk about, of course. I don't think interest in Korea has ever been higher in this country. As Neil said, Neil and I go back a long way and kind of coming back and forth between Korea and the United States. I know it's not just because of K-pop or even the Pyeongchang Olympics. We certainly could spend a whole evening talking about trade, about solar panels and washing machines and steel. All those resonate in the U.S.-Korea relationship right now, or the future of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. But of course, it's North Korea that looms so large. And I don't know how many of you remember, it seems like a long time ago now, but last November 2016, right after our election, the then president-elect went to see President Obama in the White House for their traditional meeting just a couple days after the election. And it was reported at the time, I think pretty irrefutably, everyone has to be very certain of their facts now, that one of the things that President Obama said to President-elect Trump was that the most, and I'm not sure what words he used, but essentially the most urgent and pressing and dangerous foreign policy challenge you will face in your presidency is the challenge of North Korea, and in particular the fact that it's hurtling towards a nuclear weapon capacity and a delivery system that presents new challenges to the United States and to the world. It does seem that President Trump took that on board, and it has been a rather head-spinning year. I don't think I can explain all of it, but maybe we can get, as you say, into some of this in discussions. So I gave a talk earlier this week, I confess, called, I gave it this title. I called it War and Diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula. That was a pretty good title. And it went okay, and I thought I had some pretty good lines. I'm not going to do the same talk tonight, but I thought I had some pretty good lines from President Truman and Secretary Mattis, and of course it was pretty timely. Actually, I am a fan, I confess, of Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, and one of his favorite lines, I know you probably think I'm going to quote him on diplomacy, and he has some great things to say about diplomacy, so I will, like, if you cut the funds for diplomacy, I'll need to buy more bullets or more ammunition. But the one I like as someone who's still getting it is when he told people, PowerPoint makes you stupid. So I have no PowerPoint tonight. I say that to my classes at Stanford, too. But this doesn't look like a stupid audience anyway. Anyway, so I gave this talk earlier this week, and we had a very lively Q&A session. Couldn't get to all the questions. I'll try to leave more time tonight. But my host said to me, this is my point, he said, well, we appreciated your prepared remarks, but on this topic, maybe the best thing to do is just say, I'm here to talk about Korea. Your questions and comments, please. So I was a little tempted to do that tonight. But I think I'm kind of expected to say something. So Neil told me, and actually when he sent me the flyer for the talk, as he mentioned, you were given the title of, I think, Korean Challenges to U.S. Foreign Policy. And I thought, I don't remember exactly coming up with that title, but yeah, and so he explained it. But I don't know, maybe some of your students, I think I'm just still one of these kind of diligent students. Maybe this comes from living in Korea. I was like, that's the title, I better try to address that. And so I wrote down this whole list of the sort of challenges and complexities that Korea presents if you try to think of this from the perspective of U.S. foreign policy. And again, I think it's best if I speak from that perspective tonight, and we probably talked about that, because as much as I've lived in Korea for actually 11 years of my adult life, if you count being 21 being an adult, and I do, and I have a wide-ranging interest in all things Korean. I don't think that my value added to you tonight, unless is to talk to you about all those wonderful aspects of Korea and Korean history and culture that I've enjoyed learning about over the years. So I thought I should talk about, okay, foreign policy. I was a diplomat for a long time and worked on Korea for a lot of those years. But it's a long, long list. I'm just going to list them because I can't talk about them, all of them, and you could list them too. What are the challenges that Korea poses? Nuclear proliferation, nuclear policy. Not only is the United States, what is the United States' approach to a nation, in this case North Korea, that wishes to defy the international rule that there should only be a certain number of nuclear weapon-holding states? And what about the issue of more countries getting them, either through sales and smuggling or more openly, if you like, as North Korea has increasingly done? U.S. alliance relationships. I better just list out. The U.S. and Asia, U.S.-China relations. In some ways, modern U.S.-China relations were shaped by the Korean War. I think they're going to be reshaped again now at this moment in large measure, not whole measure, by how we manage the challenges on the Korean Peninsula. Issues of sanctions, how sanctions work. What the role is of humanitarian assistance, when you provide it, when you don't. Human rights, democracy, cyber warfare. Remember, North Korea doesn't just do nuclear technology. It's devoted a great deal of effort to increasing its abilities in the area of cyber attacks and also chemical weapons. Energy, economic assistance. I'm sure I can think of some more. A whole range of environmental issues that impact directly on South Korea already and the region more widely, and of course the long-suffering people of North Korea themselves. And then, of course, there's, if you like, the foreign policy challenge of our own political system and how we achieve, and I'm just talking about this administration, I'm talking about a multi-decade effort to achieve some consistency and coherence in a problem that has, in many ways, only gotten worse. So that's kind of my list, and I listed them rather than give a whole lecture on them, so we will have time to discuss them. But maybe I can just make a couple of, I guess what I'd consider to be important points, main points that I'd like to talk about briefly and again, stimulate your thoughts and discussion. And I guess the first is just a really simple one in terms of the U.S., but also in terms, Korea matters. It really matters. I mean, it matters to the people on the peninsula who've suffered a very terrible 20th century, but it matters to the world and the United States. And it has been, again, a foreign policy challenge to the U.S. for a long time. I'm going to jump back into history just a little bit because I think the historical perspective is important and is certainly keenly felt, although the narrative is rather different in North Korea, but especially keenly felt in North Korea and also in South Korea. But the U.S. has played a very important, in many ways decisive role in the modern history of the Korean Peninsula. We could go all the way back, I'm not going too far back, to the surprising Japanese victory over the Russians at the turn of the 20th century, when Japan, feeling that it was ready to be an imperialist power in the mode of Western powers, decided that having some dominance over Korea was a good first step. And the U.S. famously did not really stand in the way, even though Korea was looking to the U.S. for protection as China struggled under its own weakness. And with the end of the Second World War and the surrender of the Japanese, which came faster than American planners had generally anticipated with the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And in 1945, here we had the state called Korea, about which we knew very little, ruled by the Japanese. And a couple of American colonels drew a line across it and said, let's take the surrender south and have the Soviets take it north so that we won't have a Soviet-dominated peninsula. I'm not going to go through the whole. And then in 1950, as the Cold War became colder and these two rival states had been set up, North Korea, Kim Il-sung took what he's viewed as an opportunity to reunify the peninsula, thinking the U.S. would not intervene, and in fact the U.S. did. And Harry Truman, one of our most consequential, I think, presidents ever, certainly made a lot of consequential and still heavily debated decisions. But he said in his farewell address when he left the presidency in 1952 that the most important decision he made in his presidency was the decision to defend the Republic of Korea. It was also one of the most unpopular, of course, because the veterans still at that war, the war didn't end until a year later after he had left office, after Stalin had died, and it ended with an armistice, not with a full peace. And it ended with veterans coming back with a sense that they had, as the expression was at the time, been in a war that was a die for a tie. Sacrifice for what? And what became known as the Forgotten War. So from this very inauspicious beginning, we first of all then had the most, really, I think one of the most inspiring and surprising stories of the 20th century, and that is the rise and blossoming of the Republic of Korea. There was some talk of this, I think, well, there's talk of it many times, but recently with the Pyeongchang Olympics, and I was struck by a column, an op-ed in the Washington Post during the Pyeongchang Olympics written by Fareed Zakaria, a very well-known public intellectual. You probably see him on TV if you watch TV. But Fareed Zakaria had a column, and the title was, Give South Korea a Gold Medal. And he starts the column off by saying, South Korea may be the most successful nation in the world. It's quite a statement. And he said, in part, that's because of where it came from such an unpromising beginning in 1948, 70 years ago, when it was established with the end of the, and then going through the war and the aftermath. But successful not only in terms of its extraordinary economic rise, to be a true middle power in the world, to have, depending on exchange rates, the 12th or 13th largest economy in the world, and so on, but because this has been combined with what I saw with my own eyes, the establishment of a democracy, which, like our democracy, any democracy has its bumps and its ups and downs, but which is something that the Korean people feel very proud of, and rightly so, and very, very committed to. It's an extraordinary story, and I think there are many of you who having perhaps seen modern Korea yourselves, whether through visits or through its soft power, as well as its trading power, know what I'm talking about. And I think, although this is fundamentally a great accomplishment of the Korean people themselves in becoming this extraordinary example of what's possible, it's also, I think, something in which, and Zakaria says this is column 2, something in which the United States can take considerable satisfaction and even some pride. We certainly, and I think even my short account of history here, which implies this, we certainly didn't do everything right or know everything very well at every twist and turn in Korea's very, very difficult journey. But I think we had some staying power, and we used, if I may cite someone you may remember, Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State while I was in Korea's ambassador and actually visited South Korea 4 times. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, used to talk about U.S. Foreign policy, U.S. Power, as being a 3-legged stool, and she called it the 3 Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development. And I think certainly in South Korea, you have almost a perfect example of where all of those elements were at play. Since 1953, the United States has had a security alliance with South Korea, which has provided security and stability and has deterred North Korea, and also provided, I think, some stability for the entire region, which has allowed not only South Korea, but the other neighboring countries of the region to concentrate on economic development and prosperity. Diplomacy and development, of course, also continued. This was a commitment over time. At one time, maybe even when you were there in the 70s, I mean, the U.S. assistance, I mean, was much, much less, but it was still an important part of the Korean economy. Now, of course, South Korea is one of the few countries that actually not only receive Peace Corps volunteers, but sends them abroad, but also is a leader in overseas development assistance throughout the world. And there's one other D, which is important, I alluded to it earlier, and that's one that Madeleine Albright often mentions, and that's democracy. And this, again, I think makes, and I don't want to make it sound like everything's perfect in Korea, in South Korea, we know it's not, but a really interesting case study, not only for American foreign policy, but for, if you like, public policy as a whole. There are some very hard lessons to be learned, and there are some very instructive ones. So that's South Korea. North Korea has obviously been a less satisfying story in terms of its journey. Really a tale of two Koreas, with the two going in very different directions. With respect to the United States, we really had very little to do with North Korea until the end of the Cold War. We were focused in the 70s on normalization with China, and within the context of the Cold War, North Korea was looking to, and sometimes trying to play off, the Soviet Union and China as it sought support, not only in terms of its security, but also in terms of its economic development. Things got very tough for North Korea with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The 90s was a time, of course, of famine in North Korea with considerable loss of life. And it was also a time when their nascent nuclear weapons program, which they've been working on for a while. And by the way, South Korea wanted nuclear weapons too. And one of my predecessors as American ambassador actually told the South Korean president in the 1970s, you can have nuclear weapons or an alliance with the United States, you can't have both. Similarly, I think the Soviet Union tried to, if you like, constrain North Korea's nuclear ambitions while supporting its desire to have some civilian nuclear capacity, because all of Korea is a place that, while it has minerals, does not have fossil fuels, well, except coal. But in any event, in the 90s is when we really saw North Korea begin to move out pretty smartly on trying to build up a nuclear program as well as a missile program. And that was also the beginning of U.S. efforts and to find ways to, or think about what the options were to stop it from doing this. And again, we tried a lot of things. Over the years, and this is a bipartisan, multi-administration in Democratic and Republican administrations in terms of the American political landscape effort from the 90s through the 2000s, through the Obama administration, to look at the options that we've heard discussed so much in recent days. And sometimes discussion is probably a too kind a word for what we hear, but military options. This small, poor country, let's just have a surgical strike. Let's take out a site when they're about to launch a missile. Let's find their nuclear facilities and do a surgical strike. We always like those words, or let's take out the regime. And again, there's been a lot more talk about that recently. Over the years, and we'll get to the present day here, but over the years, every time military options have been considered, the conclusion has been in Washington, and I would say also within the region, but certainly in Washington, that the risks are just too great. The risks of another war on the Korean Peninsula that could potentially lead to another, if you like, land war with China, a much wider conflagration. These days, the city of Seoul, only 30 miles. You don't need a nuclear weapon to reach the city of Seoul, and it's tens of millions of people. From the DMZ, from North Korea. You just need artillery, and they've got a lot of it. And the risks of, as I said, all-out destruction are so great that successive administrations have found it to be an option that they could not take. But it certainly was, and it's only gotten more challenging. We have tried a whole variety of negotiations, diplomacy, with carrots and sticks, sanctions, assistance, security guarantees, bilateral negotiations, multilateral negotiations. And these go by names like the Agreed Framework of the 1990s, which did freeze then the plutonium facilities of North Korea for a period in the 90s. They restarted it in the early 2000s, at the beginning of the Bush administration. And then we had another negotiation called the Six-Party Talks, chaired by the Chinese, where we again reached an agreement for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But by this time, it included also the uranium capacity, which we highly suspected they had, and they did, as well as the challenge of the missile program. Eventually, these agreements collapsed. But I don't agree that we should just say this is all a failure and there's nothing that we can learn from them. And that's not just because, this is one reason, because I sort of think diplomacy is a little bit like engineering. And I like to quote Thomas Jefferson when people say, don't you get frustrated when you fail so much? And he said, failure, I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work. We've learned a lot of things that don't work, but we've learned some valuable lessons, and we also have found some things that do work, at least in the short term. I do believe that had we not had, and the agreed framework in the 1990s, in particular, North Korea would have advanced all the much further and faster with its program. But still, the reality is that we were unable to stop this program. And with the advent of the third Kim and the Kim dynasty, the grandson of the founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, the young general now, Kim Jong-un, he's been in power 6 years now. Think about that. He's been in power longer than just about anybody else around him at this point, even though he's only, I think, 33, 34 years old. And he has really doubled down on trying to essentially make North Korea a de facto and, in his view, eventually recognize nuclear power, not with an arsenal like the US or Russia or China, but just enough. And he said he wants it to be a deterrent, as well as delivery, right? You need, I mean, even in this world of, I guess you can have dirty bombs and different things, there are experts here about it, but I think he wants the conventionality and the prestige, not to take it, of a missile system. This is part of being an advanced nation, North Korea style. And the missiles, as you've seen over the last year, have also been heavily tested at an accelerating schedule. And while he claims that he has now achieved an intercontinental ballistic missile capability, I think most estimates there's probably a little more work to do, although we shouldn't take a lot of comfort from this. But there's more work to do in terms of miniaturizing warheads and other challenges. But nonetheless, he has made progress, I think, that has surprised just about everybody. And I want to say it's not just the nuclear program. This is clearly a country that remains heavily isolated. The same people with all the talents and aspirations as the people of the south of the peninsula who, to say the least, have been long suffering. The economy is completely out of step with the rest of the region, which has prospered so much, including China. But it has, in recent years, just out of necessity, moved away from a public distribution system to more of a market-based economy. And that has, given people's ambition and hard work, led to some and a very, very low base, led to some economic growth. But I think the real question, and I think I know the answer to it, is how far can you go if you have just economic reform, and there has been some without opening. Remember the Chinese, it was reform and opening. Vietnam, it's reform and opening under one-party systems. Opening for North Korea is still very, very difficult because they worry about the challenge to the regime legitimacy and the challenges posed by the far more successful example of South Korea. So, and there's a lot of other things we could say about why North Korea remains such a distressingly appalling place. So, where does that leave us? Well, I like to quote, since I'm the William J. Perry Fellow at Stanford, sorry to say Stanford, but I'm going to quote him. He was Secretary of Defense, and later in his career, after he'd come back to California, he was asked by President Clinton at the time to try to resolve yet another, the crisis, the missile crisis of like the 1998, 1999, to see what was possible. And I won't go into all the details about what he did, but he looked into it and came up with some ideas. But his advice then, I think, still is very relevant. He said, let's deal with North Korea as it is, not as we wish it would be. And part of that at the time was aimed at the notion that there was a view at that time that if we just waited long enough, North Korea was going to collapse, kind of of its own contradictions. And it didn't. Now, how it survived, why it survived, we could debate that, but it has. And I would say we need to keep that advice now. We need to deal with North Korea as it is now, not as we wish it didn't have the capabilities it has already developed. But that's where we are. It's going to make any negotiation we do that much harder, and our ability to get a deal that we consider satisfactory that much more difficult. But I think my other piece of advice would be, let's look at the Korean issue, and I'm going to say the Korean issue, as a whole, not solely as the nuclear and missile issue. Because I think as long as we do that, as long as we see it purely as a non-proliferation issue, as a homeland security issue, which it certainly is, we're not going to have the sort of insights and negotiating strategy that's going to allow us to achieve a truly durable resolution. Now, okay, so what's happened over the last, I could say, year or the last, week, I suppose. I was actually in Washington 1 week ago. It was 1 week ago. Today's Thursday, right? So I wasn't really going to start here, but last Thursday I was in Washington and just doing some other meetings. And in the morning, there was the announcement, or the kind of teaser announcement about trade sanctions on steel and aluminum. Why am I mentioning that? Well, by the way, South Korea is the third largest exporter of steel to the United States. So they're quite concerned about that and how to sort of negotiate that while also trying to work with the Trump administration to coordinate North Korea policy. And then there's, all the noises in our scene, in our political scene right now about investigations and scandals and lots of other things. And then about mid-afternoon, I was aware that there were two South Korean officials, high-ranking officials, who were going to have a meeting at the White House, and it wasn't supposed to be with the president, but they were having a meeting with the White House to report on what South Korea was doing, right? Because we've had this whole rather dramatic set of developments since January 1st this year. So let me just back up on that before I get back to last Thursday and remind you that, just so we're all on the same page, that Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, really kind of took the initiative in a way and made this New Year's speech that was noted in the United States mostly because he said something about, I have a nuclear button, and so our president said, well, I have a bigger nuclear button. But that actually wasn't in my view, the most important part of the speech. It was important because he said something about his nuclear stance, which we need to pay attention to. But he said, I'm ready to participate in the Olympics. I'm ready to have a dialogue. I'm ready to lower tensions. And the South Koreans jumped right on this, and as we all saw unfold, we had this extraordinary spectacle of the North Korea and South Korea marching together in the Olympics. Now, that doesn't mean all problems are solved, but it's an opening of a window. Is it an exit ramp, that Kim Jong-un is trying to get on? Is he doing it because he's under pressure from sanctions? Is he doing it because he's really afraid of a war? Is he doing it because he wants to take a pause? You'll hear lots of people assert it's absolutely this or it's absolutely that. And I would just say, I certainly feel that it's become a cottage industry to sort of say what North Korea does and why it's doing it. And I don't feel that sense of confidence myself. We have to approach this, in my view, with a sense of that we're pretty ignorant about actually this regime in the North, which, by the way, is one good reason to have some kind of conversation with them. But in any event, this is all a good thing. And the South Koreans, now to get up to last Thursday, sorry for wandering off there, but if you're following me, the South Koreans after the Olympics, they went up to Pyongyang, they met with Kim Jong-un. It's the first time we've really seen him in a high-level meeting like that. It wasn't the president of South Korea, but right, his senior advisors, and came away planning for a summit meeting between the South Korean president and the North Korean and Kim Jong-un. It's pretty surprising. There's only been two before, and again, they went well sort of at the time, but the follow-through wasn't so great, to say the least, so they agreed to that. And they came back with the message, these are our South Korean allies, that Kim Jong-un wanted to talk to the United States, wanted to talk to President Trump. He's ready to denuclearize. So they came to Washington, as allies would, to deliver that message, to what they had heard, to talk about it. And to the astonishment, not least of the South Koreans, but I think to absolutely everybody, President Trump then asked them to go out and said, yeah, I'd love to meet with Kim Jong-un. I'm not sure that's exactly what he said, but I'll meet with Kim Jong-un. He wants to meet with me. I'll meet with him. Let's do it as soon as possible. And South Koreans, would you please go out and announce that I'm going to do that? So this is, to put it mildly, unconventional as a diplomatic approach. I think everyone's a little, to use an old Northern Ireland word, sort of gobsmacked about it. Let me back up again and say this is an administration that has certainly been very unconventional and, in my view, very, very good diplomatic word, unhelpful in much of its public rhetoric. But it's also pursued certain lines that have been consistent. I'm sure President Trump would deny it, but have actually been consistent with past administrations. And that is in trying to marshal international support for stronger sanctions. And they've been pretty successful in that. They've been actually pretty successful at the UN. Now, it's helped that North Korea has been so has been so aggressive in its testing program. But this notion of maximum pressure, they've done a pretty good job of maximum pressure. And the other part of what they said they want is maximum engagement. And maximum engagement is what we haven't really seen, and we haven't really known what it looked like. We've had a situation over several months where we had a Secretary of State who now, and since last Thursday was fired. I don't think it had anything to do with that, but we don't really know. But had been calling for some kind of diplomatic effort, and at times then hearing from the White House and from the President himself that this was not the way that he wanted to go. In any event, a certain amount of incoherence, but at the same time underlying that, certainly increased sanctions and international cooperation. And I would say certainly a military threat that seemed pretty real, and for some people, probably all too real. At the same time, there was a drawing of, some what we call red lines of saying, if you do that, right, so the drawing of the sand in the playground, then we're really going to do something. And there seemed to be some signals, and the Trump administration is not the only one who's done it. It's happened in other administrations. And then the North Koreans are pretty good at kind of going right up to that line, and then maybe just a little bit sideways, right? It's like someone on the beach, right? So they say, if you do an intercontinental ballistic missile, they'll be fired fury, whatever, like you've never seen before, right? That was something. Well, they do a test, but instead of going horizontally, they'll go vertically, and they get the same distance. So that sort of, if you like, a little bit of cat and mouse, at the same time raising tensions, I think increasing the chance, frankly, of just escalation and of miscalculation. So there was a lot of worry. A lot of that worry has now been lessened, at least for the moment, with the clear signal from North Korea and from the American president that they want to pursue some kind of dialogue. Now, the North Koreans have not yet responded. I mean, this could change by the time we leave tonight, but as far as I know, the North Koreans have not officially responded to this announcement, well, from the South Koreans, subsequently confirmed by the White House that the president is ready for a summit. But as I said, I think it's good that it's dialed down the temperature for a while. And another thing I think is good, these are the good things, I'll get to my worries here and then I'm going to finish. South Korean diplomacy has really stepped up, and they've really achieved something. And I think that it's important to have diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula that has Seoul in close coordination with Washington very much at the center. This is the Korean Peninsula. It needs to be a Korean solution. But, what are the challenges now as we look to what the next steps might be? Again, I'm almost going to go back to my list that I started with, and this is where I'm going to end. Alliance management. We still have a South Korean public that wants to make sure that they're going to be safe and secure. And, oh, by the way, allies in Japan who felt they were left out of this discussion, which they were. China, not an ally, but an important partner in this. So managing that's going to be very important. And it's going to be very important, whatever kind of diplomatic process may start and however long it takes. And if it takes a long time, that's a good thing. The thing I worry about most is one that starts and then stops too quickly. But through that time, we need to have a very consistent policy of continuing to, if you like, to do what we've done for 65 years on the Korean Peninsula, and that is essentially try to deter provocative acts, attacks, try to keep the temperature down as much as we can. But one really key question is going to be, Nick, what do we mean by denuclearization? So the words that are kind of bandied about are, on the U.S. side, and this is a word that successive administrations have used. We want to see we want North Korea to give up its nuclear program and its missile program, but we talk about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Well, North Korea talks about that too. Now, when the U.S. has talked about in the past, and also the Trump administration at times, has sometimes used a phrase CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization, right? Everything. And I mean, that may sound, well, it's kind of an acronym, but verifiable, and some of you experts know, that's not that easy, especially for uranium programs, especially in a closed country like, so that's not something you just say, we've done it, we've done it. Verification takes time. Irreversible takes time, right? And some people could actually ask, what really is irreversible? I mean, the North Koreans took measures before to diminish their capabilities. Turned out over time, they really weren't irreversible. So we're talking about something that's very ambitious to achieve it, and I'd be interested in opinions from the experts. But that's what the US is thinking of. When North Korea has used the phrase denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and we don't know what they mean this time, because they haven't said, but what they've meant in the past has sometimes included some of the following. We, the DPRK, that's the official name for North Korea, come to the table as a nuclear weapon state, and we come to negotiate an arms control agreement as an equal with you, the United States. Our vision is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and that means that there should be no alliance relationship between the United States and South Korea, or U.S. troops in South Korea, or what's called extended deterrence, or the so-called nuclear umbrella. The United States should not be extending its nuclear reach to South Korea or to the Korean Peninsula, because that is not consistent with denuclearization. So I think at the very least, there'd have to be a discussion about what would be some of the first steps you would take on denuclearization, and for the United States, a very challenging decision of to what extent do we acknowledge, acquiesce, see it as it is with the presence of nuclear weapons for a time while they are frozen, reduced, and so on. This is where you get into the kind of agreements, and you see it in the Iran case, which is far, far, far less advanced, where an agreement is almost by just practicality as well as political necessity going to be a slow and step-by-step process. And sometimes politically, that's very hard to sell. And that takes me, I guess, to I'll make this my last point. One of the challenges we've had over the years in addressing the Korean Peninsula and the challenges of North Korea is we have elections. We have elections not just for president every 4 years, we have congressional elections every 2 years. And one of the problems with the agreed framework is it was negotiated by President Clinton in 1992, 1993. The Republicans took the House in 1994. They didn't like it. They didn't want to fund it. They thought it was a bad deal. Again, we see some of the same things with Iran now. And successively over time, we've had elections. Now, I hasten to add, I think this is a good thing. But what it does say to me is, on an issue like this, I think that we have to try even harder. And today's political climate here, it's maybe impossible to forge an approach that can enjoy bipartisan support, that can survive from election to election in overall measure. Because while I vastly prefer, obviously, to say the system we have than a system where you have someone in power generationally, as is the case in Korea or maybe the case in China, as we see, this puts us in a sense at a kind of a disadvantage when it comes to dealing with these kinds of issues. So I would certainly hope, and this may be a great pipe dream, as they say, but that President Trump would find a way to look all the way back to his predecessors. They've all been involved in this North Korea issue. President Carter, as a former president, went to North Korea and met with Kim Il-sung back in the 90s. Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, right, all the way down, Obama, and say, let's try to learn some lessons from this. This makes me very naive, perhaps, and let's find a way forward on what we can all agree is to finish the unfinished business of the Korean Peninsula, where the U.S. has been so involved, and to work for a Korean Peninsula that is whole, free, and at peace, and doesn't have nuclear weapons. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, Madam Ambassador, thank you very for those thoughts. We will proceed as follows. We will have a little bit of a conversation up here, and there are certain things, as you can tell from my background, having lived in Korea myself, I have a deep attachment to the Korean issues, and having been a professional intelligence officer for my whole career focusing on nuclear proliferation in Pakistan, inevitably that means I'm also analyzing North Korea. So there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot to worry about. So let me begin by asking if you would expand a little bit about the issue of alliance management and what's going on. If we were here 6 weeks ago, we would be worried about the threat of war, and now I'm worried about the threat of peace.
That's better, though, sort of.
And I say that because I worry about lifted expectations and false hopes for what might come out of this planned summit. And what it brings me back to is asking a question about whether or not President Trump has been, both in talking about war and in talking about peace, reaching over the head of our allies in Seoul. And I ask both your thoughts about both at the public level and at sort of at the private level. Public, I mean, to what extent is President Moon engaged in the peace process? He wasn't involved in the war process in the sense that the threats of fire and fury were not a function of consultation between Washington and Seoul. And I wonder whether or not the talk about a summit between Washington and Pyongyang is also done without input from Seoul. The second part of that is when I lived in Korea in 1970, these many decades ago, there was a deep hatred among the South Korean people for the North Korean regime. I wonder whether or not, to what extent, things have changed. Now, 5 decades make a huge difference, not just in my life, but in how people feel. But you have a recent experience of working as ambassador with people sort of at ground level. You inevitably talk with people. Have they changed in how the people view the North Koreans, and are they ready for a transformation, not just of diplomatic relations, but a transformation of sort of the emotional contact between the North and the South?
Yeah, all great questions, big questions. I mean, first of all, with respect to the Trump administration and alliance management, again, just to back up, not so far, but to the election of Donald Trump at the end of 2016. I was actually on election day. I was at an election party. They have that at the American Embassy in Seoul. And then I went to Tokyo afterwards. And I mean, no one in Asia expected Donald Trump to be president. They were surprised, and they were trying to respond and react. Japan and Prime Minister Abe responded with great quickness. He actually, I mean, literally, he got on a plane and went to Trump Tower within a week of the election and began to establish a relationship with President Trump. And they play golf together. They've established quite a good relationship. And I think that is, if you like, reassured our Japanese allies that at the leader-to-leader level, they can manage it. That said, last week when President Trump announced that decided that he was going to meet Kim Jong-un, that was without consultation with Abe. So the Japanese are, again, a little disconcerted by this. The trade issue also underlies our relationships, obviously, with allies throughout Asia. The decision by the Trump administration to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, was not received well in Asia, except perhaps in China, because it was seen very much in the region as a sign of U.S. commitment to continuing to be a leading kind of shaper of the trading environment and the security environment in the region. So against that background, South Korea was in a, if you like, a particularly sort of delicate position because, as some of you may know or recall seeing, South Korea was going through its own sort of unscheduled or early political change in the winter of 2016 to 2017 with these growing demonstrations against then President Park Geun-hye, who was eventually impeached, and a snap election was held, even though South Korea is not a presidential system. They still it's not a parliamentary system. They had an election essentially 6 months earlier than they might have, and they had a new president, Moon Jae-in, from the opposite party, elected less than a year ago, last May. So you had this as a long answer, but a long period where South Korea didn't really have an interlocutor. They were in their own political crisis. And I think they did worry very much, obviously, on the trade issues I've mentioned, but also on the North Korea issues. All that's kind of flipped around a bit now because, I mean, with this Olympic diplomacy, if you like, and this announcement that that Moon Jae-in is going to have a summit, I mean, still to be, you know, it's announced, but still to be had, if you like. You never, you know, count it until it's had. But in April, to have a summit with Kim Jong-un, I would say North Korea has really grasped the initiative, and South Korea, along with it, has really stepped up its diplomacy. So I think the risk is now, you're right, a year ago it was what was called Korea passing, meaning Seoul passing, that Korea would become a bystander, or even, you know, a bystander and a host to a war that it did not want and to decisions it did not want. Now I think, you know, there are great expectations on South Korea, if you like, to kind of deliver, to deliver on this kind of implied promise that dialogue will get us somewhere. So that gets to the kind of worry you have. You know, again, I don't know exactly what was said. It's so unconventional and puzzling to me last Thursday, but my understanding from reading the press is that these two South Korean officials meeting with their counterparts in the White House, you know, were told President Trump wants to see you and to hear about your trip to Pyongyang where you met Kim Jong-un, and they said to him something like, and, you know, Kim Jong-un would like to meet with you, Mr. President. We'll practice this meeting, see? And he said that he's prepared to talk about denuclearization, and you don't have to cancel your military exercises is another thing, and he really wants to meet. And President Trump said, when can we meet? And will you announce it? And so, you know, you also had, this is really, for those of us who are, you know, former diplomats, I mean, this is just like unimaginable then that the South Korean officials go out to that area where they have all the microphones and announces a plan by the American president to meet with a leader, and not just a leader of a country that no American president, sitting American president, has ever met with before. So, so not to fuss too much about the process, but it's just a demonstration of how we really are in kind of uncharted territory here. And the other thing I didn't mention, so I'll mention now in my talk, but much commented upon in the press and by all who follow Korean issues and foreign policy in general, is the State Department has been somewhat hollowed out, especially at the senior levels. And so there literally is right now kind of an absence of capacity or people with experience to kind of start putting these things together. It doesn't mean that there aren't good people who can't do good things, but I think there's an urgent need right now, if this summit is going to be held in May, the Trump summit, the Trump-Kim summit, it's still hard for me to say that, they've got to get cracking, you know? I mean, even if it's a summit where they can agree that, I think, you know, come to some, yeah, again, I'm having trouble thinking what it is, kind of grand agreement of denuclearization. The devil in this case really is in the details. You know, sometimes people compare it to like Nixon going to China. You know, Nixon going to China, one, there was a lot of preparation for a couple of years. Two, it was pretty clear what we wanted to do. We were going to normalize relations with a country that we had normalized relations with. This is, which, you know, it was pretty clear already what we wanted to do. Here it's very unclear because it's very, very unclear that Kim Jong-un is really prepared to give up his nuclear program. And in my view, he's not, at least not in a timely manner.
So is it possible to imagine, the reason I say I worry about peace now is because a failed summit, a summit perhaps like the Kennedy-Khrushchev summit in Vienna in 1961, where they both left one feeling he had taken advantage of the other, and the other feeling he had just been manipulated, meaning President Kennedy felt he had been manipulated. What happens at the end of the day if, in fact, the summit occurs and there isn't a sense that both sides have gotten something positive out of it? Now, I think, you know, you just gave the example of China and Nixon going to China. Normalization was in the cards. Right. Can you envision normalization, meaning an American embassy in Pyongyang based on nothing more than a promise of negotiating the elimination of North Korean nuclear weapons?
Well, I want to be careful about saying I can't envision something. I mean, normalization,
especially at this time.
In these past failed agreements I mentioned, the 1990s, the agreed framework, the 2005 six-party talks, normalization was in there. And it was actually, but starting with, as we did with China, with the liaison office. But certainly some kind of diplomatic normalization is going to be part of a deal. You know, should it be front-loaded? I mean, the challenge now is, as I said earlier, you know, North Korea is so much further along with the nuclear program. It's declared itself a nuclear state. Well, the U.S. can, but would the U.S. president decide to normalize with a country that has, if there is an implicit recognition that it is a nuclear state? So, as I say, I think there are ways those things can be finessed. I do think that normalization should be a part of it, but I think we have to be, I think it is a process.
By the way, I think some of you may have taken cards when you came in to offer questions to Ambassador Stephens when you came in, but we will continue the conversation until such time as I have questions from the floor by those cards. In your talk, you said, look at North Korea in the wholeness of its statehood and don't just focus narrowly on the nuclear issue. Well, one of the issues that has tended to fall a little bit by the side is human rights issues. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit more about how we approach that issue? How can we incorporate the issue of human rights? And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, you know, the Otto Warmbier case is a good example. There's a good book called The Aquariums of Pyongyang, which captures what it's like to live there. There's a lot of sources, but the issue is one that has not been centerpiece in discussions. It has been pushed aside. How do we incorporate human rights and the approach the North Korean government takes toward its own citizens in any kind of reconciliation or resolution, diplomatic process?
I think that's a key question, and I think one of the takeaways, if you like, of our experience with North Korea over the years is that if there was a time in earlier negotiations where the sense was that the nuclear and missile issue was such a priority that we simply had to focus on that to the exclusion of anything else, that time is gone. So I think there have been a number of steps that have been taken by the United States and by the international community to make clear that that North Korea's attention is being paid and efforts are being made to highlight the difficulties of the extreme difficulties of people in North Korea and the horrific human rights situation there. For example, there is now a UN rapporteur or special representative for North Korean human rights, and he writes a report I think about every year. Now, does that help the people in North Korea? Not directly. It helps to shine a light. It helps to shine a light, and North Korea does care about its international reputation. And there are certain, I would say, issues that are somewhat politically less sensitive for them. I mean, they like treatment of people with special needs, even that they've begun to respond to international complaints and demands that they do something about them. The issue of, human rights, and the issue of American and other citizens being kidnapped or arrested or in North Korea, essentially in some cases, in my view, held hostage for political terms, for political reasons, is something that we need to address very clearly. And getting back to the summit, there are at the moment 3 U.S. citizens being held in North Korea for a variety of charges. Again, we don't have an embassy in North Korea. Sweden is our so-called protecting power. Swedish diplomats there have difficulty with getting frequent access or sometimes get no access to these. And there are others from other countries as well, including South Korea. I certainly think that if you were to do a summit, for example, these 3 American citizens should be released before you have a summit. So I think, again, it's going to be and I think it's going to be part of a normalization discussion. And your question about could we just open up an embassy, it would not be just related to the question of North Korea's nuclear capability and stance. It would also have to be in some way, I think, related to a commitment to, again, you'd find some language to conform to minimal international expectations and standards on human rights.
One of the questions I just received is connected to this, and it has to do with the new expected to be Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Do you have a sense, given your experience, and also there's a long history of U.S.-South Korean intelligence cooperation, is he uniquely positioned, given his experience at the CIA, now moving into the State Department, to further relations between the U.S. and Korea, South Korea, either in terms of the peace overtures or reinforcing South Korea's position vis-a-vis the North?
Well, I like to keep an open mind, and I think that 2 possible strengths that he would bring into this job is that he does appear, at least for now, to enjoy a strong relationship with the president and influence of the president. I think that's very important for any Secretary of State. And secondly, as you suggest, although, I mean, he's been at the CIA for a year, but he's been director of the CIA, and there is a certain, I mean, I think with the North Koreans too, kind of a sense that the intelligence services kind of play an important role here, and that he might have a certain amount of weight or gravitas because of that particular background. With respect to how he will approach the issue itself and whether or not he will give the president, differing advice or what kind of advice it might be, I think there's room for some concern, but I think we just have to wait and see. My sense is that Secretary Tillerson was, genuinely trying to find some kind of diplomatic opening with North Korea, but he was, undercut at every step by, well, first and foremost by the North Koreans, but also I think by the White House and by the fact that it was just clear to everybody that he and the president weren't on the same page, at least in what they were saying publicly. So that made it very difficult. So I think if we have a Secretary of State and a president who can kind of get on a page and stay on it, and if it's in the context of trying to, in the first instance, put together, as you say, a summit that's going to move the ball forward, then that would be very welcome.
As we look at the discussions, question from the floor, and let me just read this. In preparation for talks with North Korea, should we insist on a specific agenda of commitments from the North? And what sort of nuclear de-escalation should we seek in a first set of meetings? Yeah. Well, again, this is where, so if this was just sort of, my negotiation to start, I mean, I would, do the sort of traditional thing, call me a traditionalist, and kind of almost, start from easy and go to harder. But I mean, just, and some people have even suggested we haven't talked to each other for a long time. So I think one initial sort of conflict, as I've already, or potential just blockage, as I've already suggested, is that the North Koreans will say what they've consistently said now for several years, which is, we're here on the basis of our established identity as a nuclear weapons possessing state. We have them only for deterrence. But we have nuclear weapons and we're not giving them up. So if we hear that, I mean, are we just going to walk out, say we have no basis? You have to say you're going to denuclearize or not. I would say that would be probably a very short discussion. That's why the summit's a little bit worrisome. If you do it at lower levels, then, maybe it ends up you doing the summit. You say, all right, you've stipulated that, right? It becomes a little, you've said that, I heard you. Now I want to say to you that the U.S. position remains that there should be complete and verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and that means no nuclear weapons in North Korea or South Korea.
And then you could see where you go from there. But I think you would have to find some, if you like, confidence-building measures. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can talk about that are short of a complete resolution of all the issues. Like one thing is getting inspectors back in. Now, North Korea has had international IAEA inspectors, I mean, you know, well, there at various times when we've had agreements in place. That, to me, has been an unmitigated good thing. Will the inspectors see everything they're doing? No, they'll be very constrained. They'll have to negotiate where they can go, what they can see, and they probably will miss some things, but they'll be there. That would be a great first step. And then you take the next step. You get more access for the inspectors. Then you begin to talk about safety. Then you begin to talk about communications. And this is something that the North and the South have started on too. Let's have a hotline so that at least we, you know, if we have a conflict, it's because we meant to, not because we just had a miscommunication. So I think there's a lot of room to start with things like that. But if the two leaders, you know, want to have the overarching principles, that's going to be very tough. But we did have, and I would commend you to read, now the 2005, during the Bush administration, joint statement of principles by the 6 parties. I mean, there you have denuclearization, normalization, peace treaty. We haven't talked about peace treaty. That's another thing that North Korea has put on the table on a number of times, but has been unready to really engage on. So the issues really haven't changed. So I find a lot of international, you know, crises, if you like, but we've got to kind of create the atmosphere and the context where we can go at them, hopefully issue by issue.
A couple of questions here, and I'm afraid we won't get to all of them, but a couple of questions are oriented toward the role of U.S. forces in South Korea. How does that play into the whole package?
Right. Well, we have a mutual security agreement with South Korea that we signed in 1953 after the signing of the armistice. This was at the insistence of the South Koreans, who wanted to make sure that we didn't leave them to the tender mercies of the North Koreans. But it's an alliance that has really grown in scope and in its strength as South Korea itself has grown so much stronger. I mean, it has meant that we have far fewer troops than we used to have. We have about 27,000 now. And of course, South Korea has a highly capable military and is investing more in capabilities that are more consistent with the 21st century. And of course, they have conscription as well. But I certainly think that in terms of a negotiation, our consistent position has been, and I think it should remain, that the alliance is not on the table. The alliance is something that's between Seoul and Washington, 2 sovereign countries. I mean, even China sometimes. China has in the past sometimes said, oh, all these U.S. alliances, they're relics of the Cold War. And, you know, we said we have friends and partners and alliances. That's part of what makes the United States, I think, an unusual power in the world and an important power that's been a positive, overall, a very positive force in Northeast Asia since World War II. So I would say that's not on the table, but you know, if you get into negotiation, you start to talk about military exercises. Again, I wouldn't want to, even in my completely non-official position, I wouldn't want to second-guess our negotiators. But I think that there are probably issues that have been considered somewhat taboo that you would have to think about. Military exercises in the past, I mean, things that we have done, again, and try to build confidence, is to have military exercises to invite the North Koreans to come. The North Koreans have also been invited to come and inspect or visit, inspect, I don't know what you would call it, U.S. and South Korean military facilities. We have at times canceled exercises at times of negotiations or postponed them. We in fact did postpone an exercise during the Olympics. So there's a lot of things that you can do to both build confidence and to show a readiness to make progress. And I think there is a tendency in times of tension to think that those are all sort of taboo, we can't do them. But I think we can do them as long as President Trump has shown, he has a summit. I mean, people thought that was at the very end. You can do, but they do have to be reciprocated. I don't think this is a conflict that you can solve maybe with one fell swoop. I think it does have to be a step-by-step process.
We have a question from a student who identifies himself as a member of the class of 2020. And the question is whether or not, and it asks us to sort of get inside North Korean thinking a bit, do you think that perhaps this is really nothing more than a ploy by the North Koreans to show a positive face in order to get sanctions removed from the UN and elsewhere? And it's sort of countered by another question, which is, takes us in a completely different direction. Is there any prospect for South Korea initiating conflict on its own against North Korea?
That's a great question, yeah. I mean, on the second one, I cannot really imagine a scenario where South Korea would initiate some sort of serious military, try to, let's say, try to bring down the regime in North Korea. Certainly not under the present government. I think again the most likely scenario is escalation that begins sometimes with a miscalculation. We're talking about a DMZ that then goes out into what's called the West Sea, where there are many, many points of potential conflict. And we've seen this over the years. And you have a defector from one side, you have an exchange of gunfire, and it escalates. It escalates. And that's always something that's a great danger. But I think that the intent on the part of the South Koreans at this point is to avoid war. Now, if they thought that the North Koreans were about to launch some kind of strike, I think that they would, in close consultation with the United States, talk about how they might want to do something, whatever it is, preemptive or defensive. But no, I don't see the South Koreans as looking to, and they said explicitly they don't want to. To try to bring down the regime. Sort of things really changing. It's too big a burden. It's too big a risk for them. Your other question was about
whether North Korea is just
North Korean
to
intent.
take advantage.
Yeah, and the sanctions. Well, this is it. We don't know what's in the mind of Kim Jong-un. I think we have to assume it's a variety of things. He has a policy that he calls Byungjin, which is it's a character for like military and for the economy. And the idea is a dual-track approach of strengthening through the nuclear program the military stance and also strengthening the economy. There is, I think, some evidence that he thinks that now he's made great progress on the nuclear front and the missile front. Now it's time to concentrate on the economy, and to concentrate on the economy, he needs to get some relief from sanctions, something economic going, especially with South Korea, where things have been pretty cut off after a period when South Korea did play a relatively important economic role in times of less tension with North Korea. So I certainly think that's a part of it. But again, we just have to. This is another reason why it's good to talk to the North Koreans. Not that we really don't know, but yeah, the South Koreans have certainly made a point of saying they think that the North Koreans, and they want to give the U.S. and President Trump a lot of credit. I think they're sincere in this, that they think that the tightening sanctions, as well as the credible threat of military action, has concentrated the minds, especially one particular mind in North Korea. But I think there may also be some confidence. This is my own speculation. Some confidence on his part. I mean, he may want those things. Some confidence that he's to a point in his program where he can kind of try to relieve a little bit of the pressure in these other areas, including on the sanctions. You asked a question. I'll go back to about public opinion in South Korea too that I didn't answer, and that's again kind of a complicated question, and. Because I think there are generational differences, and I'm sure there's some Koreans in this audience who would have their own perspective on it. Clearly, the generation that experienced the Korean War, that remembers the Korean War, has pretty much passed from the scene. When you and I were first in Korea, we knew them, and they were in the positions of power in Korea, but they were and they were. This was deeply embedded, and there were also actually a lot of Koreans who'd come from the North, either because they were persecuted for their religion or for their economic standing, and they were fiercely anti-North and anti-communist, and this was also the ideology of the regime. As South Korea has become so prosperous, so democratic, and as generations have now grown up who don't remember those days, not only the days of the Korean War, but the days when South Korea was really about the same economic level as North Korea, the threat seems less. And I think that they've gone through periods of time when they've thought of North Korea as just something kind of to be managed. But I think over the last couple of years, because of the testing program, in the aftermath, I was ambassador in Korea when there was this shelling attack on a South Korean island west of where the big airport is, that for young South Koreans, first of all, there was a sense that perhaps there is some real danger coming from the North, and I shouldn't say perhaps, but I mean a greater sort of visceral awareness of it. And also a little bit less attachment to the notion that we have to bend over backwards because the North Koreans have suffered so much. So, I mean, my example in this, I'm not explaining this very well, is I think that the Moon Jae-in government in South Korea, the current, which is from the part of the political spectrum that has been generally more pro-engagement, or let's try to reach out to our brothers in the North and to find a peaceful way forward. And I think that there was, and generally, I think the younger generation has been supportive of that. But when the announcement was made that there would be a unified women's ice hockey team, and that some South Korean women ice hockey players would lose playing time to accommodate the North Koreans, it ran up into another South Korean attitude, especially among the young, is, wait a minute, this is a highly competitive place, and these people worked hard. Why are we giving them our spots? Why are we bending over backwards? So I think that actually caught the Moon government a little bit by surprise. And I mention that because I think this whole issue of what is public opinion and what are the generational differences is something that I think even in South Korea, they're still trying to kind of figure out. And it will depend a lot on what happens, obviously. But I wouldn't take anything for granted or overgeneralize about it.
Well, you added that. I was going to ask another question that came from the floor, which is as follows. For over 20 years, North Korea has sort of talked out in front while at the same time threatening South Korean soldiers on the DMZ. And how do you overcome that? And what I was going to say is there a naivete in the South? But your answer, I think, is that indeed not. That there's a mixture and that there's a certain pride in South Korea and a reluctance to engage in what they saw happening in Germany, where there was this full embrace of the East by the West Germans, and to some extent there's buyer's remorse with respect to that particular purchase. And whether or not the South Koreans want to go through that is very much an open question, it seems to me.
Yeah, well, South Koreans worry about the cost of unification, of course, but I think they also recognize, I mean, they may have no choice in a way, but they'd like to have, wouldn't we all, a soft landing, you know, and they'd like to have this paced out in a way. But I think they recognize that, and especially increasingly now, that the status quo is really not very sustainable. And from the North Koreans' perspective, its existential threat is really South Korea. You know, I mean, this is not the question that was really asked, but if the Chinese tried very hard over the years just to convince North Korea that they could reform and open their economy, just like China did, while still maintaining essentially one-party control. And Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, looked at this. He visited, Shenzhen and, Shanghai and all these places and came back and occasionally kind of tried it, but concluded, again, now here I'm kind of projecting, but I think he really concluded, and probably rightly, that may work in China and that may work in Vietnam, where they've also done it while maintaining one-party control. But in North Korea, you always have the mirror image of South Korea. You have the existential sort of threat of South Korea's success. And once you start to let that little genie out of the bottle of reform and opening, you can't control it in the way that to date China and Vietnam have been able to control it, if you like. And so that's just the reality, and something that both South and North Korea will have to grapple with.
We're almost out of time, and again, I always have to apologize that we can't take all the questions, but there is a question that takes us in a little bit different direction and taps into your experience and your decision-making yourself. And I think it's helpful if you could comment in this response to this question for undergraduates who are thinking about what comes next, even graduates who are thinking about what comes next.
I'm thinking about what comes next. Yeah.
We do have dinner plans, so we have to go into that. What inspired you to pursue this line of work, specifically in Korea?
Yeah.
What advice would you give to someone interested in pursuing foreign service and foreign policy?
As an undergraduate, I kind of got the international bug, and I spent my junior year in Hong Kong and wanted to learn more, and so I joined the Peace Corps. I know UC Berkeley, Cal sends a lot of Peace Corps volunteers around, and I still think it's a great experience. I was lucky enough to go to Korea, and like a lot of people who go to Korea, and you went there in 1970, I mean, it embeds itself deeply in you. So part of that's because you're young. I mean, I was saying to Neil earlier, I kind of became an adult in Korea at the age of 21 or 22, so it really shaped me. So I recommend doing things like that, some overseas experience, and internships. There's a lot more NGOs. There's a lot more. But I guess I would say, because I'm a practitioner more than an academic, I mean, get some experience. Learn a language, do those things. These are great universities, and it's great to spend some time here. But couple it with some other experience. Yeah. What was the other question?
No, just
that was it.
What advice for someone going into foreign service and so on? Yeah, I think you captured it. So
I mean, I was thinking, well, yeah. There was one thing I wanted to say, which is why I don't know if it's my last question, because I was sitting here and I was actually thinking, because it's almost March 17th, and thinking about negotiations. I don't know how to fit all this in, but so I spent. I didn't spend my whole career in Korea. Obviously, I spent about half of it more than half of it in Europe, and then in some other places. So one thing about the Foreign Service and about a diplomatic career is it allows you to have kind of a great menu of things you may get involved with. But I think there are a lot of skills that are transferable. So the other part of it would be to kind of develop the skills, the cross-cultural skills, their negotiating skills, their just substantive management, leadership skills that I think really are transferable. But yeah, I just wanted to say, because I was thinking about it as I came here today, that it's 20 years, sort of next week, that is the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, for any of you who follow Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland is an issue I worked on both in the US and then 3 years living in Belfast for essentially about 4 or 5 years of my life. And we got an agreement. What does that have to do with North Korea? Yeah, Northern Ireland and North Korea. We had an agreement. Everybody celebrated. All the headlines pretty much went away in April, so Good Friday, 1998. It took a decade to implement that. And in the following decade, it essentially has been kind of falling apart and putting back together again. So I guess my other sort of big lesson of that, what I'm saying is, these things really are processes, and just the way our politics and our media and our own kind of busy lives work is we're done with that, did that, did North Korea, did Iran, did the Balkans, did Northern Ireland. It's not that way, and you see that when you're in foreign affairs, when you're a foreign service officer, that you have to have, however successful a summit may be. I'm sure you see this in arms control too, right? However great it is, it really is about the implementation, and that goes on for years. That in a way is kind of unending.
It's an amazing combination of idealism and hard work that's required in the Foreign Service, and for those of you who are interested, I think we have a good example of the joys and the success in that field. Thank you very much for joining us, Kathy.
Thank you.